This is a News Center 7 special presentation.
On December 17, 1903, two brothers, neither with a college education or even a high school diploma, conquered what was at that time man's greatest obstacle. With a motorized bi-wing glider conceived and constructed in Dayton, Ohio, the Wright brothers achieved powered flight. I'm Jim Baldridge. During the next hour, you'll see how two industrious and inventive brothers from Dayton made history and witness through pictures, archival footage, and their own words the challenges and struggles of their pursuit. This is the Wright brothers fighting for a dream. The story of the Wright brothers begins long before that historic day of December 17, 1903, on the beaches of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Wilbur Wright once said, "If I were to give a young man advice as to how he might succeed in life, I would say to him, pick out a good father and mother and begin life in Ohio." Milton Wright, the father of the Wright brothers, grew up a hard-working Indiana farm boy who spent most of his free time buried in books and worshiping with his very religious family. At 26, already an ordained minister and teaching at Hartsville College, he met student Susan Catherine Corner, the daughter of a Maryland carriage maker. After a courtship of nearly 7 years, the couple wed on Thanksgiving Day, 1859, and began their family in east central Indiana. With 2 children in tow, the Wrights moved to a farm in Millville, Indiana in 1867. It was here, on April 16th of that year, that Wilbur Wright was born. Willie, or Will as he was called, began walking at 10 months. During his tenure at Hartsville College, Milton, now a bishop in the United Brethren Church, was appointed to the influential position of editor of the Religious Telescope, the church newspaper. The offices were located in Dayton, Ohio. When the Wright family arrived in Dayton in 1869, they bought a home on Hawthorne Street in West Dayton. The home was modest and typical of those in the working-class neighborhood. On August 19, 1871, Orville Wright was born in the upstairs front room of the home. 3 years later to the day, baby Catherine was born.
Growing up, Orville and Catherine were just extraordinarily close, especially, and they sort of caught up with Wilbur. And the three of them, who remained together with their father in his house on Hawthorne Street in Dayton after their mother's death, when Orville was still in high school and Kate was actually only 15 when her mother died. That event just pulled them together. So by the time they're adults, young adults, they're just members of an extraordinarily close family who are there to support one another. And I think if it hadn't been for that, somebody else probably would have invented the airplane. That was very much a part of who they were and why they were able to do what they did.
Life for the Wright children was fairly idyllic, and they spent their days playing a version of hide-and-seek called Fox that covered several neighborhood blocks. Like most siblings, there was plenty of rivalry to go around. Wilbur took enjoyment in teasing his younger brother's mispronunciation of words. That was until the day Orville retaliated with a heavy rock. When the children were young, the bishop and Susan encouraged them to nourish their curious nature. In 1878, that curiosity was piqued.
In the history of technology, we don't often give enough credit to toys for sparking innovative thinking and invention. When they were quite young, Wilbur was 11 and Orville was 7. Their father came back from one of his church trips with a little toy, a helicopter. And it was just a simple wind-up thing. You rubber strands and you wound it up and let it go and it would bounce up against the ceiling. But, I mean, it absolutely captivated them. And in later years, when people would ask them how it had all began, they always talked about that little toy when they were kids and how they had never forgotten it.
Beginning in 1877, the Wright family moved 3 times, from Dayton to Adair, Iowa, from there to Richmond, Indiana, and finally back to Dayton in 1884. When they returned to Dayton, Susan was suffering from early symptoms of tuberculosis. Bishop Wright found that he had been reassigned to the West Coast for the next 4 years, and again hit the road. Wilbur, who had dropped out during his senior year of high school, was left behind to care for his mother. But soon he would experience medical problems of his own. While playing on the ice of an artificial lake near the soldiers' home in Dayton, Wilbur was hit in the head with a stick. The injury greatly affected Wilbur, causing him to forego college. Instead, he stayed home to care for his mother. Meanwhile, Orville, attending Dayton's Central High School, developed a great interest in the printing business and started his own classroom newspaper called The Midget. Bishop Wright put an end to that publication after only one issue, after reading a story entitled The Inherent Wickedness of School Children, supposedly written by Orville's teacher. Orville's interest in printing led him to drop out of school and work full-time as a printer. On March 1, 1889, he published the first issue of the West Side News. Later renamed the Evening Item, the paper gave an account of the area's news. Paul Lawrence Dunbar, the son of freed slaves and a classmate of Orville's, wrote for the paper and eventually published a newspaper of his own. Dunbar would later become recognized as the father of African American poetry. On July 4, 1889, Susan Wright lost her battle with tuberculosis. The family buried her at Woodland Cemetery in Dayton. After her mother's death, Catherine took over the household chores, but she left Dayton in 1893 when she enrolled at the Oberlin Preparatory College to become a teacher. Meanwhile, older brothers Wilbur, Rushlin, and Lauren were starting a club called the 10 Dayton Boys. Orville was too young to join. Members consisted of 10 young West Dayton men who met once a year beginning in 1886 for an elaborate dinner and social gathering. At each meeting, members would update the club on their doings for that year, and detailed minutes were kept. The last entry would be in 1939, when the last 2 surviving members met for the last time. During the next few years, the Wright brothers became bored with the printing business and were looking for something new to pursue. America was swept up in the bicycle craze, and the brothers enjoyed that activity as well. Soon, they became known for their expertise in bike repair, and in the spring of 1893 opened the Wright Cycle Exchange. It was later renamed the Wright Cycle Company. Most of their business came from repair work, but they also sold new bicycles and took trade-ins as well. Over the next several years, the Wrights opened up 5 or 6 more bike shops. To help their business grow, they used their printing resources to publish a paper called Snapshots of Current Events, which contained news articles, humor pieces, and advertisements for their shop.
Our bicycle business is beginning to be a little slack, though we sell a wheel now and then. Repairing is pretty good. We expect to build our own wheels for next year. I think it will pay us and give us employment during the winter. Orville Wright, October 8, 1895.
The original model was called the Van Cleve, and it sold for $65, a hefty price in 1896. Several other models followed, and their financial outlook began to improve. But their romantic life was not a priority. It may have been seeing their older brothers struggle with the responsibilities of married life, but it's evident that the younger Wrights were not interested in romantic relationships. The brothers were shy, and as Wilbur confessed on more than one occasion, he didn't have time for both a wife and a plane. Catherine, their sister, seemed even less interested.
Mr. Sheffield called on us last evening in a dress suit. You never saw anything so affected in all your days. He had a goatee, which adds to this ridiculous appearance. He was just as friendly as ever, but he is such a dude and so affected, I couldn't be natural and cordial. Catherine Wright, June 1900.
Wilbur and Orville never married, but Catherine did later in life. None of the 3 ever had children. They built strong relationships with their nieces and nephews. Back at the bike shop, the work was steady, but neither of the Wrights particularly liked running the business, preferring to work on the mechanical aspects. In the upstairs room of the shop, they had begun work on a new project, a bi-wing glider. By August of 1896, a German scientist named Otto Lilienthal, experimenting with manned gliders, had completed nearly 2,000 flights.
Then tragedy struck during a test when he fell some 50 feet to the ground. He died the next day. Several weeks later, Wilbur came across an article reporting the accident.
We were so interested in aeronautics that we discussed matters in this line almost daily. We could not understand that there was anything about a bird that could not be built on a larger scale and used by man. Orville Wright.
Eager to solve the mystery of powered flight, Wilbur sent a letter to the Smithsonian Institution asking for copies of all papers submitted on the subject. Once he received the material, he spent endless hours studying theories of flight. Later that summer, the brothers completed a small two-wing kite glider with a 5-foot wingspan and began testing it with success. The next phase would be putting a pilot at the controls. In 1900, the Wright brothers began building another biplane glider, patterned after the design of early flight experimenter Octave Chanute.
Octave Chanute, who was born in France and came to this country with his father when he was only 6, and who was sort of a self-trained engineer. At the turn of the century, when the Wrights first made his acquaintance, Chanute was one of the most successful civil engineers in the country. Just an extraordinary guy who had fallen in love with the idea of flying. And he was an extraordinarily outgoing guy. He was one of those people who, if he believed that somebody had potential, he would just give them the shirt off his back. And so, when he got, in 1900, a letter from these 2 bicycle builders in Dayton, Ohio, rather than dismissing them out of hand, he became very excited. And it didn't take very long before Chanute recognized that he had letters from lots of other young people like this who were interested in flight. But it didn't take him long to recognize that these guys were truly different.
With the glider nearly completed, testing it was the next challenge. Wilbur suggested testing it in Dayton with a 150-foot tower and a counterweight pulley mechanism. But it was decided they needed wind and someplace for softer landings. The search began. Coming up, the Wright brothers' dream becomes a reality, but they almost gave up on their dream before that historic day at Kitty Hawk. And later, you'll find out why the world was not ready to believe that the Wright brothers were actually the first to fly, and we'll tell you about their battle to prove it, when the Wright brothers fighting for a dream continues.
Catherine, the sunsets here are the prettiest I have ever seen. The clouds light up in all colors in the background, with deep blue clouds of various shapes fringed with gold before. The moon rises in much the same style and lights up this pile of sand almost like day. Orville Wright, October 14th, 1900.
The Wright brothers traveled to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in September of 1900. They assembled the new glider by the first week of October and began manned flights, with one brother holding the ropes, the other brother on board the glider. They had some moderate success early, but they realized some of their calculations were inaccurate.
They returned the following summer with a bigger version of the glider, but still found their designs were flawed. They became discouraged.
When we left Kitty Hawk at the end of 1901, we doubted that we would ever resume our experiments. When we looked at the time and money which we had expended, and considered the progress made and the distance yet to go, we considered our experiments a failure. Wilbur Wright, 1911.
When they arrived home, the brothers constructed a small wind tunnel to test their new design and found it beneficial. The following spring in Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers made nearly 1,000 flights, the most successful of which was 622.5 feet in 26 seconds. By late fall 1902 and early 1903, news of the Wright's success was spreading. But that success was just with a glider. The next step was adding power. The Wrights applied for a patent, but their request was rejected. The patent office said their description was too vague, and the machine seemingly incapable of performing its intended function. But they persevered with the new design and built a larger and sturdier version of their most recent glider. This glider came equipped with 2 important additions: a small 12-horsepower gasoline engine and twin propellers connected to the engine through a chain and sprocket transmission system. In the fall of 1903, the Wright brothers returned to the sandy beaches of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, with a new plane and new hopes. After nearly 2 months of assembly and adjustments, the first attempt to fly the new plane came on December 14th. Wilbur took the first flight after winning a coin toss with Orville. His flight failed, however, and the flyer was slightly damaged in the test. After repairs were made, it was Orville's turn to take control of the plane. On December 17th, at 10:35 a.m., the Wright flyer lifted off the launching rail and traveled 120 feet, staying in the air for 12 seconds. The Wrights made 3 more successful flights that day. They had done it. The Wright brothers had solved the basic problem of powered flight. A telegram sent home to Dayton shared the triumphant news of their success. Bishop Wright documented the event in his diary.
In the afternoon, about 5:30, we received the following telegram from Orville, dated Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, December 17th. Success, 4 flights, Thursday morning, all against a 21-mile wind. Started from level engine power alone. Average speed through air, 31 miles. Longest, 57 seconds. Inform press. Home before Christmas.
Could the Wright brothers have invented the airplane without Kitty Hawk? No. They had to have a place like Kitty Hawk that gave them the wind and the soft sand and the hills and no trees. They had to have a place like that. If not Kitty Hawk, it had to be a place like that. At the same time, had they been from Kitty Hawk, they never would have invented the airplane. They had to be from some place, again, like Dayton, if not Dayton. They had to be from a place where they were surrounded by the technology. You know, Dayton was an up-and-coming, go-getting town that was full of foundries, light machine shops, factories making bicycles, cash registers, precision items.
On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers achieved what some thought impossible. But soon, this success created more challenges and legal battles to keep their dream alive. Next, the Wright brothers were successful at Kitty Hawk in getting a plane into the air, but find out why their efforts to build an airplane business couldn't get off the ground. And later in the show, you'll see how the Wright brothers were thrilling spectators with their own air shows, but not without tragedy. You're watching the Wright brothers, fighting for a dream. Success has a price. As word of the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk spread, many of the previous airplane experimenters came calling, some causing great suspicion. Augustus Herring, a flight experimenter who had worked with Octave Chanute on earlier glider projects, referred to himself as the true originator of the two-surface glider and believed he had a monetary claim to the Wrights' work. The brothers dismissed his request, saying that there was very little similarity between their design and Herring's. Their success came from solving problems previous experimenters had failed to realize. They decided it was time to apply for another patent and hired attorney Henry A. Townlin of Springfield. He convinced them to wait until a more practical airplane was completed. In 1904, the Wright brothers traded the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk for the open country near Dayton. The 100 or so acres of Huffman Prairie, 8 miles east of Dayton and now part of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, were ideal for flight testing. Torrance Huffman didn't think much of the Wrights' flying antics, but he gave them permission to use his land anyway, as long as they drove grazing farm animals off the pasture before attempting any flight. On August 13th, after nearly 4 months of failure, the plane finally took off and flew a distance of 852 feet, a new record. But even with this success, crashes were still occurring too often. A new launching tower was employed, and almost immediately they experienced success. That summer's experiments were capped off by 2 monumental flights, both lasting more than 5 minutes in the skies of Dayton. With this proven design, along with the knowledge gained, the Wright brothers began thinking about the profit potential of their flying machine. The Wrights were first approached by the British, but the brothers believed the U.S. government should have the first chance.
There is no question but that the government in possession of such a machine as we can furnish, and the scientific and practical knowledge and instruction that we are in a position to impart, could secure a lead of several years over governments which waited to buy perfected machines before making a start in this line. Wilbur Wright, January 10, 1905.
U.S. Secretary of War William Howard Taft, another Ohio native, handled the Wrights' proposal but felt the plane was less than practical. Rejected and feeling that their credibility had been brought into question, the Wrights began talks with the British. The brothers asked to be paid 500 pounds sterling for each mile the plane covered during testing. With their recent successes, the price tag could have topped 25,000 pounds sterling, approximately $35,000. The Royal War Office said the proposal exceeded the allotted budget and put the deal on hold. During the spring and early summer of 1905, the Wright brothers began building a refined version of the 1904 glider that gave the pilot more control, thus making it more practical. The changes were not successful at first, with one accident leaving Orville badly bruised. But late August brought success, and they were flying circles around Huffman Prairie. On October 5th, with some 30 invited guests looking on, Wilbur flew for a sustained period of 39 minutes and 25 seconds, landing only after his fuel ran out. The flight, their personal best, was longer than all their flights in the last 2 years combined. The great achievement of powered flight did not come without serious problems. The brothers became fearful that others seeking fame, or more likely fortune, would steal their innovations. They decided to stop flying altogether until their patents were issued. That did not occur until the following year. By the fall of 1906, the Wrights were being pressured to fly publicly. Octave Chanute believed that others would soon conquer flight and feared the Wrights would lose money and credibility. But the brothers were confident.
When we see men laboring year after year on points we overcame in a few weeks, we know their rivalry and competition are not to be feared for many years. Wilbur Wright, October 10, 1906.
Their refusal to fly in public hurt their credibility, especially in Europe, where even a rumor of a powered flight made news. The brothers weren't worried. Wilbur even commented that only if the pilot traveled more than 300 feet would it be a true accomplishment. Unknown to Wilbur, Alberto Santos Dumont in Paris had already flown his aircraft 726 feet. Santos became a hero and an outspoken critic of the Wrights.
There is absolutely no evidence to support the alleged statements of the Wright brothers. They may have flown, but there is nothing in any report of the proceedings that inspires confidence. Alberto Santos Dumont, 1906.
To this day, the country of Brazil still gives credit to Dumont for achieving powered flight before the Wright brothers. When we come back, the Wright brothers try to build more than a dream. They try to build a business and find some unlikely buyers for their airplane. And later, suspicion over a fatal crash puts a cloud over the Wright brothers' accomplishments.
Even though the Wright brothers had their share of skeptics as to whether they were the first to develop powered flight, the business of airplane building was taking off.
The Wright brothers took their pitch for building and selling planes to both the government and private businesses here in the United States. But they couldn't make a sale here, so they went to Europe. The French showed a lot of interest. In fact, it was because the French were interested in the Wright brothers' plane that the U.S. government decided to take another look at the invention. Lieutenant Frank Lamb, Jr., a U.S. Army Signal Corps officer studying in France, wrote a letter to the Army Board.
I have just had an interview with Mr. Orville Wright of Dayton, Ohio, in regard to the purchase of the aeroplane. It seems unfortunate that this American invention, which unquestionably has considerable military value, should not be first acquired by the United States Army. Lieutenant Frank Lamb, Jr., 1907.
Shortly afterward, the brothers received a letter requesting their presence at a meeting with the U.S. Army. The Army's design requirements were extensive. The vehicle had to carry 2 passengers, stay airborne for at least 1 hour, travel a distance of at least 125 miles, and fly at 40 miles per hour. And most importantly, it had to land without crashing. Wilbur headed back to Kitty Hawk to make adjustments to the 1905 Flyer. Meanwhile, in Europe, Flint & Company struck a deal with the French that would give the Wrights 500,000 pounds sterling for the first completed plane, 50% of the initial shares in the syndicate, and 20,000 francs for each of 4 more aircraft to be delivered. Soon, though, a letter arrived from Flint and Company stressing that the French were growing impatient, and unless a flight demonstration was provided, the deal could fall through. Wilbur immediately left for France, prepared to dazzle the Europeans. But upon his arrival, he encountered many frustrations. But by August 8, 1908, all obstacles were overcome, and he rolled out the aircraft for testing in front of a grandstand of spectators.
The Wrights had become sort of legendary figures because they hadn't flown in public but had made all of these claims. A good many of the French, for example, began to doubt that they had actually done what they said they had done. But when Wilbur flew, all doubts vanished. And it became instantly apparent to everybody that everything they said about what they had done starting in 1900 must be true. And, you know, they can clearly do things in the air that nobody else can do.
In the crowd was a French lawyer named Ernest Archdeacon. He had been the Wrights' loudest European critic.
For too long a time, the Wright brothers have been accused in Europe of bluff, even perhaps in the land of their birth. They are today hallowed in France, and I feel an intense pleasure in counting myself among the first to make amends for the flagrant injustice. Ernest Archdeacon, August 9, 1908.
Wilbur's celebrity grew rapidly in Europe. Back at the Army testing grounds at Fort Myer, Virginia, Orville was dealing with his own notoriety. On September 3rd, an anxious crowd gathered at the Fort Myer testing grounds to see the first military demonstration flight from American soil. Orville took to the sky and flew only 1 minute and 11 seconds. But over the next several days, he broke all previous records. One flight lasted 70 minutes and 24 seconds. But these public demonstrations ended in tragedy on September 17th. Bad weather had kept the plane grounded, but by that afternoon, the skies cleared. Orville was scheduled to take Lieutenant Thomas E. Selfridge on a tandem flight. They launched around 5 in the afternoon that day and flew 3 circles around the grounds. Suddenly, Orville felt a tapping from the rear of the plane. He cut the power and tried to land. But then he heard 2 very large thumps, which were followed by violent shaking. The plane fell from the sky and crashed straight into the ground at top speed. The crowd raced from the grandstand to the crumpled plane and found the passengers buried in debris, both bleeding from the head and unconscious. They were removed to a nearby hospital for treatment. That night, Lieutenant Selfridge died. He became the first airplane passenger to lose his life. Coming up, the airplane industry is born, but the stress and the many lawsuits take a toll on one of the brothers. And see how a famous flood in Dayton almost washes out decades of achievements when the Wright brothers, fighting for a dream, continues. Orville would spend the next 7 weeks recovering in the hospital at Fort Myer. Catherine, upon receiving the telegram of Orville's accident, quit her teaching job at Central High and rushed to be by his side to supervise his recovery.
The nurses are nice, but Orville likes to see me. I kept him quiet all afternoon by reading to him. He does not hear what I read, but the monotonous sound of my voice puts him to sleep often. Catherine Wright, 1908.
When Wilbur got word of the accident, he was convinced the mishap was caused by Orville's lack of concentration.
Catherine, I cannot help thinking over and over again, if I had been there, it would not have happened. It was not right to leave Orville to undertake such a task alone. I do not mean that Orville was incompetent to do the work itself. A man cannot take sufficient care when he is subject to continual interruptions. Wilbur Wright, September 20th, 1908.
The cause of the accident was soon discovered, and it wasn't Orville's fault. A propeller had split during the flight, clipping one of the lines holding the rudder in place. The rudder twisted out of position and forced the machine to the ground. November of 1908 found Orville Wright recovering from the accident at Fort Myer, and Wilbur Wright in France, preparing for his first public flight in Europe. 2 months later, feeling strong enough to travel, Orville, along with Catherine, traveled to Europe to join Wilbur. In France, the press followed the Wrights' every move. The smallest details were reported as big news, from the style of hats the Wrights wore to the clothing Catherine bought on shopping excursions. The Europeans could not get enough of the Wrights, whom they had once called bluffers. While in Paris, Wilbur took Catherine on her first flight on February 15th. He had to tie up her skirt so it wouldn't tangle in the gears. In late March, the Wrights returned home and began building another plane for the U.S. Army. But if they thought they would escape public adulation at home, they couldn't have been more wrong. When the Wrights arrived in Dayton, nearly 10,000 people lined the streets to greet them. And this was just the beginning. A bigger celebration was soon to follow. The Wright brothers' Home Days celebration on June 17th and 18th included receptions, elaborate parades, concerts, and fireworks, much to the Wright brothers' dismay.
The Dayton presentation has been made the excuse for an elaborate carnival and advertisement of the city under the guise of being an honor to us. As it was done against our known wishes, we are not as appreciative as we might be. Wilbur Wright, June 6, 1909.
The highlight of the celebration was a ceremony in which they received medals from the city of Dayton, the state of Ohio, and the U.S. Congress. The morning after the celebration, the Wrights left for Fort Myer. Their plane was waiting for them in crates. When the Wright brothers arrived at Fort Myer, Orville was still wincing from pain as he began the new round of test flights, which didn't begin smoothly. On July 2nd, he had another crash after the engine cut out, forcing him into a small tree. A news photographer who snapped a few photos of the crashed aircraft provoked Wilbur's anger. Wilbur threw a piece of wood at the photographer and demanded the exposed photo plate. The plane was quickly repaired, and over the next 10 days, Orville was setting new records. With a passenger on board, Orville climbed to 400 feet and traveled at an average speed of a little over 42 miles per hour, 2 miles per hour faster than the Army required. That flight sealed the deal with the U.S. Army, and the Wrights sold the plane for $30,000. The airplane industry was born. But any elation the Wrights felt soon vanished, driven away by the lawsuits in which they would become entangled. Other flight experimenters were forging ahead, but most were stealing the Wrights' designs and violating their patents. The Wrights' first target was the Herring Curtis Company, which unveiled a plane called the Golden Flyer on June 16, 1909. The Wrights filed a patent infringement lawsuit against the company. Many more lawsuits would follow. On October 19, 1909, Wilbur was back in the air, making history. At College Park, Maryland, in one of his last public flights, he took Mrs. Ralph Vandeman on a short hop. This friend of Catherine's became the first woman to fly from American soil. With several new contracts and a $1 million investment from the firm J.P. Morgan, the Wright Company was incorporated on November 22, 1909. Corporate offices were opened in New York City, and the factory in Dayton began production. The Wrights were happy with this arrangement as it allowed them to concentrate on the construction of airplanes and leave the business operations to someone else. The patent fights, however, continued and now extended into Europe. Wilbur shouldered most of the burden himself, traveling from lawsuit to testify. The exhausting pace caught up with him in April of 1912 when he became seriously ill while in Boston. After a few days of recuperation, Wilbur returned to Dayton, but was still experiencing a high fever. After an initial misdiagnosis, Dr. D.B. Conklin determined that Wilbur had typhoid. Although seriously ill, Wilbur tried to carry on with his work, but he was growing weaker, and the prospects of recovery didn't look good. With the entire family gathered at their Hawthorne Street home on May 30th, 1912, Wilbur Wright died at the age of 45. Bishop Wright's diary entry.
A short life, full consequences, an unfailing intellect, imperturbable temper, great self-reliance, and as great modesty, seeing the right clearly, pursuing it steadfastly. He lived and died. Bishop Milton Wright, May 31st, 1912.
Wilbur was buried in Woodland Cemetery, near where his mother lay. The rest of 1912 and early 1913 found Catherine and Orville traveling in the United States and abroad. In March of 1913, they returned home, just 5 days before the worst disaster in Dayton's history. Torrential rains began falling on March 23, 1913. That was Easter Sunday. Soon the banks of the Miami, Stillwater, and Mad Rivers were overflowing. Widespread flooding devastated much of Dayton. Bishop Wright estimated that Hawthorne Street and the first floor of their home were under 8 feet of water. Even the bicycle shop was flooded. Fortunately, airplane materials, including records and glass photographs, were undamaged. But Orville found the crated 1903 Wright Flyer, the one that made history at Kitty Hawk, submerged under 12 feet of water. Luckily, a wall of mud had protected the plane from serious damage. The year before the flood, the Wrights had purchased a 17-acre wooded lot in the Dayton suburb of Oakwood. Catherine felt that the family needed a more elegant residence to receive a growing list of distinguished guests. Orville oversaw the construction of the home and designed many of its features. Once it was built, he spent many hours here in his study. They named it Hawthorne Hill, after the Dayton street where they grew up. The Wright Company factory was untouched by the flood, and business resumed. The Wrights' top mechanic, Charlie Taylor, was helping run the factory. Orville admitted he was more interested in building planes than managing a business. On October 15, 1915, Orville sold the Wright Company for an estimated $1.5 million. In 1916, Orville decided the family needed a vacation and took them to the Canadian islands in Lake Huron's Georgian Bay. He enjoyed the surroundings and privacy, and especially enjoyed swimming with the family dog, Sipico. Orville loved the area so much that he bought an island as the family's own private vacation spot. But things were not so cheerful the following spring. On April 3, 1917, the family patriarch, Bishop Milton Wright, died at the age of 88. He was buried next to his wife Susan and son Wilbur in Woodland Cemetery. Following the sale of the Wright Company, Orville started a new company with Dayton businessmen Edward Deeds, Harold Talbot, and Charles Kettering. The Dayton Wright Airplane Company built aircraft for the U.S. effort in World War I, and it remained in business until 1923. In retirement, Orville's popularity grew. He was looked upon as one of the greats of his generation. But even with this adoration, Orville Wright remained painfully shy and reserved. He still made public appearances, but very sparingly. Family was his main focus now. His nieces and nephews would often come to visit their Uncle Orv at Hawthorne Hill. In 1926, Catherine Wright married Henry Haskell, a friend from Oberlin College, and moved to Kansas City. The occasion was not a joyous one for the entire family. Orville felt betrayed. He believed that he and his sister had made an unspoken pact to preserve the inner family circle and not become involved with romantic relationships. The two never reconciled, and 2 years later, Catherine died of pneumonia. Even after he knew she was going to die, Orville at first refused to go see her. He finally relented and arrived in Kansas City just before her death on March 3, 1929. With the permission of Catherine's husband, Orville brought his sister's body back for burial at Woodland Cemetery. Over the next 3 decades, Orville was embroiled in yet another fight, this time with the Smithsonian Institution. The museum seemed to be suggesting that the Wrights were not the true inventors of powered flight. Many people at the Smithsonian felt that Samuel Langley, a Smithsonian official and designer of this airplane, the Aerodrome, achieved first flight in 1896. This and other claims incensed Orville, and he retaliated by honoring a request from England. He donated the refurbished 1903 Wright Flyer to the Science Museum of London instead of the Smithsonian. Although the Smithsonian eventually acknowledged the accomplishment of the Wrights, the controversy would always exist to some extent.
Wilbur and Orville Wright are the inventors of the airplane. There are lots of claims out there for people who say they flew before the Wrights, but it's all balderdash. None of those claims have ever held any water.
Next, Orville entertains some famous visitors at his home in Dayton, and he settles a long feud with the Smithsonian Institution. Orville Wright lived out the rest of his life as a reluctant celebrity, defending the brothers' legacy and spending time with family. Many distinguished guests from around the world would call on Hawthorne Hill. Among them was Orville's close friend, Charles Lindbergh, who flew into Dayton on June 22, 1927. Upon Lindbergh's arrival, people converged on the grounds of Hawthorne Hill. Orville convinced Lindbergh to appear with him on the front balcony and wave to the crowd. Orville later revealed that he was more concerned about saving his lawn than pleasing the gathered crowd. Another visitor was Henry Ford. He purchased the Wright Cycle Shop and the Wrights' old home on Hawthorne Street and moved them to Greenfield, Michigan, as part of an outdoor museum. Orville received many medals and honorary degrees, and countless monuments were dedicated to the Wright brothers' accomplishments. While working in his laboratory on the morning of January 27, 1948, Orville suffered his second heart attack in 4 months. He died 3 days later at the age of 77. Dignitaries from all over came to Dayton to pay respects. The funeral procession moved to Woodland Cemetery while 4 jet fighters swooped down low, dipping their wings as Orville Wright was laid to rest. As a final contribution to the history of aviation, Orville bequeathed the original 1903 Wright Flyer to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It was retrieved from the Science Museum of London and became part of the permanent collection of the Smithsonian Institution.
The final resting place of the Wright brothers here at Woodland Cemetery is a reminder of how they lived their lives, surrounded by family in a place called Dayton, Ohio. But Wilbur and Orville were not just 2 simple bicycle makers from Dayton. They were 2 brothers who dreamed of the impossible and struggled to make that dream a reality. Their legacy allows future generations to fly with the eagles, to walk on the moon, and to grasp for the stars. This documentary would not have been possible without the extraordinary help from some very special people. First of all, our thanks to Wright State University's Special Collections and Archive Department. Don Dewey and Tony Jeske spent countless hours going through hundreds of photographs and documents with us in order to give you a unique and personal view of the Wright brothers. Wright State University has preserved an extensive collection of Wright brothers' writings and photographs for future generations to enjoy. Special thanks also to Mary Oliver at the Montgomery County Historical Society and to Dr. Tom Crouch of the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian. To celebrate the Wright brothers and the Centennial of Flight, Dayton is throwing a party and the whole world is invited. The Inventing Flight celebration from July 3rd through July 20th will be an event you won't want to miss. The celebration includes Olympic-size opening ceremonies on the 3rd, 150 hot air balloons, blimp rides, astronauts, concerts, and entertainment. It ends with a once-in-a-lifetime air show featuring the Thunderbirds, the Blue Angels, and the Canadian Snowbirds. We hope you make plans to come to Dayton as we celebrate Inventing Flight, July 3rd through the 20th. I'm Jim Baldridge. Thank you for watching The Wright Brothers, Fighting for a Dream.